Good afternoon. I'm Leonard Sachs from the Office of Medical Policy at FDA, and I'd like to welcome you all to this FDA webinar. Today we will be discussing the final guidance entitled Electronic Source Data in Clinical Investigations. Many of us are familiar with the sight of a pile of thick case report forms in triplicate, a jungle of sticky notes, a whole team of monitors comparing one piece of paper with another piece of paper, a bunch of investigators fretting over corrections on data that they've forgotten about months before. And this is really the reason for our guidance. Electronic platforms give us the opportunity to revolutionize clinical trials, but their adoption has been slow by the pharmaceutical research industry. And our guidance describes a research environment where data can be electronically collected while the investigator sits in front of the patient without the need for any paper records. The centerpiece of this program is the electronic case report form, which acts as an electronic machine to assemble trial data coming from many different sources. This may be from study personnel, this may come from labs, this may come from imaging services, might come from pharmacies, patient-reported outcomes, etc. The electronic case report form records where the data comes from, it records when it comes into the system, it records changes to the data, when they are made and by whom, and it ensures that the data are accurate and complete at the time of entry by using flags and by using prompts. In a few moments, my colleague Ron Fitzmartin will go through some of our recommendations to ensure that the data collected electronically are reliable and that we can figure out where they come from. As many of you know, this final guidance was preceded by a draft guidance that we published in 2011. We're very grateful for the many comments that we received from the public on that document, and Ron will also emphasize some of the changes which were made in response to those comments. Do you want to close that?
The computer's going to shut itself down in 40 minutes.
Oh, okay. We'll just have to speak quickly.
There you go.
Yeah, I was just mentioning that we'd published a draft guidance in 2011, and Ron will mention some of the changes that were made in response to public comment on that draft guidance. In writing this guidance, our hope is that, at least our hope from the point of view of FDA, is that industry will embrace these new electronic platforms and will benefit from the advantages. And we believe there are many advantages, including the improvement of data quality, getting rid of transcription errors, preventing fraudulent data, facilitating remote monitoring, saving costs, simplifying data storage, and so on. So at this point, let me hand over to Ron from the Office of Strategic Programs. His presentation will be followed by a short session during which you can send us your questions live, and they will be discussed by our panel members, Jonathan Helfgott and Irfan Khan. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the fda.gov website. Thank you. Ron.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, and looking forward to a good session. We have a lot of material and certainly not a lot of time, so we're going to plow ahead. I'm not going to go topic by topic, but this is some of the topics that I'll cover in this talk. So why eSource? Why now? Why the guidance? Well, Leonard talked about some of the reasons, but in a nutshell, the guidance clearly promotes capturing source data electronically. It is very much a proponent of eSource. Some of you who were perhaps on the forefront of electronic data capture remember those days and how long it took for EDC to become ubiquitous in clinical data management in the pharmaceutical industry. Well, we're trying to get ahead of that, of wasting decades. We want to promote the electronic capture of source data. But with that said, certainly we need to ensure the reliability, quality, integrity, and traceability of electronic source data. We certainly understand that this is a paradigm shift. This is not something that's going to be easily done overnight. If it was, we wouldn't need this guidance, and we wouldn't be here providing this webinar. So we know that this is going to take some time, but we wanted to make sure that industry knows that we are clearly promoting electronic source data capture. So take a look at this cartoon, and I call it a cartoon because it does not, it's not meant to represent any particular environment. It is a cartoon of a clinical site and a sponsor/CRO data EDC environment. It's not, forget about whatever the various systems that are listed there. This is to show that there are, today, shadow CRFs are being used. So paper is being used to jot down source data and enter it into the EDC eCRF system. And we think that this is not efficient, as Dr. Sachs said. It's certainly not efficient, and it certainly lends itself to data errors. So what we would like to see in this diagram is direct entry into eCRF, getting rid of the paper. So what you see there is that a direct entry by investigators into perhaps an EHR, and then a transmission electronically, automatically into an eCRF, or in fact the authorized site personnel entering directly into the eCRF. Of course, there's the added component of FDA oversight. For site inspections, FDA will want to come out and to review source data, and those data need to be available to the inspectors. Certainly, Jonathan Irfan could go into this in more detail later on. A little bit about the development of the draft of the guidance, how we got to the final guidance. As many of you know, there was an initial document in 2011. There were a lot of concerns expressed in the public comment, frustration, a lot of issues arose. There were many more than is listed here, but they focused on does the investigator have to sign off prior to sponsors' review of the data? There was a lot of discussion around the eCRF and whether it was some monolithic entity, CDMS, clinical data management system. There were comments about the prescriptive tone of the guidance, that it was telling industry how to do data management. And there was also references to exchange of data using HL7 standards. So because of that, we decided that we should not issue the final guidance, but rather go back somewhat to the drawing board and to revise and issue another draft. And so we did. And the typical review period, comment period for guidance is 60 days. We decided, because of the complexity of the topic, to extend it to 90 days. And we received quite a number of comments, 37 organizations, 367 lines of questions, and they certainly were very thoughtful. We spent
The team spent many months going over those comments. I say that they were positive. I would say most of them were positive. There were a couple of negative barbs there, but by and large, we certainly appreciated all of the comments and went through every single one of them. 65% focused on data capture and data review. So there certainly was a clustering around the same topic areas, which was good and certainly helped us in our deliberation on developing the final document. So we felt that we were headed in the right direction and that we would go forth and issue the final guidance. Now, as you know, there's some terms in the guidance that some folks have said, you know, these are not standard terms that you see in pharma clinical data management. Well, I mean, some of them perhaps, others certainly we see them every day. So I thought it would be important to go a little bit further to explain some of the key concepts, terms from the guidance. So the Ecrf, there's a lot of discussion and comments around the Ecrf. I mean, we see it principally as an EDC system that have been out there. These systems have been out there for many, many years. For the purposes of this guidance, we do not see the Ecrf as a concept. There are a lot of questions and comments that perhaps we were interpreting Ecrf as a concept. And that's probably understandable given that there was a little prescriptive nature in the earlier draft. But no, we look at the Ecrf as a clinical system, and clearly it is an electronic record. Also, we certainly understand there were some comments about FDA thinks that there's only one single system for the capture of clinical data. No, absolutely not. We certainly realize that clinical trials have become more and more complex, and the sources of data are varied. And certainly, we don't think today that the Ecrf is the single system for capture of all data. And then, so some of the key definitions on in the guidance talked about data originators, right? Device, instrument, system, and person. We feel because we're talking about electronic source data capture that a data originator is no longer just a authorized study personnel, but can be a device, as in a blood pressure monitor, instrument, electronic patient-reported outcome instrument, a system. Could be an EHR, it could be a lab system, or it can be an investigator, radiologist, subject. All depends upon the protocol and the clinical trial that's being conducted and the what data you need to collect. And certainly this is not saying that e-source data capture is for every single trial. This is a decision that each company needs to make. What is important is that the data originator needs to be authorized, and that needs to be specified. Data elements. Well, these are what we all know and love and have been collecting for decades. Variable level data, smallest unit of observation for a subject, blood pressure, in a diabetes trial, perhaps hemoglobin A1C, a pain intensity score, what have you. What's important is that each data element is associated with an authorized data originator. So, as it says, nothing new here. This is common in audit trails today. The DEIs, the data element identifiers, well, perhaps just a fancy word for an audit trail. We want to know who entered or transmitted the data, when it was done, if there changes were made, when and why. Certainly these are basic components of an audit trail. There are audit trails and systems today that go way beyond some of these this functionality. So, for instance, data entered transmitted to an Ecrf should have data element identifiers. This would be applicable to, for instance, laboratory data that are transmitted directly to the Ecrf. Data that were entered directly into the Ecrf by authorized site staff. There were several comments during the comment period about audit trails and whether the audit trail in the Ecrf should be available to downstream systems. Now, I know that there are a number of companies out there that are looking at the technology, the capability for maintaining an audit trail through downstream systems, but there is nothing implied in the guidance that audit trails are to be transmitted downstream from one clinical system to another. Source data. All right. This is the only, well, Jonathan will be up here in a bit, so he may cite some more regulations, but this is the only regulation that's in my talk here today, the 21 CFR 312-62. And this is right from the guidance. All information in original or certified copies of records of clinical findings, observations, or other activities in a clinical investigation. Source data. All right? It's critical to have access for inspection purposes to source data. So a very important item is know your source. So documentation of your source is critical. So, source data, what about it? Well, it should be Alcoa. And it wasn't easy to find this graphic. I grew up with Alcoa wrap, but now it's called whatever, Reynolds wrap or whatever. But this acronym Alcoa can be found in the WHO Handbook for Good Clinical Research back 8+ years ago, and it's mentioned in the Computerized Systems and Clinical Investigations Guidance of 2007. And so what do we mean by that? Well, source data needs to be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. So to drill down a bit on each of these, attributable. Well, who entered the data? There you go. There's our data originators. That's the audit trail. Legible. Well, back in the day, we were doing pen and ink case report forms. Legibility was certainly important, strikeout and initial, but what we're talking about here in the electronic world is electronic data and metadata in human readable form. Any modifications should not obscure prior entries. And again, this is all part of audit trails. Contemporaneous, we certainly know, and I certainly lived through it in my days in industry, of case report form information that sits at the clinical site, and a good chunk of time, days, weeks, maybe sometimes months go by before the data are entered into the Ecrf system. What we're talking about now is we want to see an electronic entry into the Ecrf. And so if we eliminate those paper phantom shadow CRFs, then we can have more timely availability of data. And certainly the audit trail provides information on the time of entry collection and entry into the Ecrf. Original, what's the earliest record? And certainly changes and corrections should not obscure prior entries, as I said before, and this is all part of audit trail. Accuracy. The Ecrf data should be a valid representation of the source data. Corrections should be documented, and quality control measures. The technology that's available today provide us with so many capabilities to check data upon entry, not only downstream, but right at our fingertips as the data are transmitted or as an investigator or site personnel are entering the data. And certainly this is all part of audit trails as well. All right, a little bit about the source data capture section and the different ways of getting source data into the Ecrf. Well, certainly the first one is the worst case, because this is what we were talking about of shadow CRFs. It's a duplication of data sources, increased likelihood of errors, and, as I said, delayed access to data. So a best case, direct entry of data into the CRF, into the Ecrf. No intervening paper step. What we have here is less confusion on what the source really is. We don't want it to be a paper, a piece of paper that is in a file cabinet. Direct entry, all right, so decreased likelihood of errors and best case. Is the best case. Okay. Automatic transmission of data from devices or instruments. No paper required here. Improved data quality and availability. Documentation of the source is very important. You need to understand your process. If there's an intervening process, if the data are going to a reading center, going to another data repository, that needs to be taken into account to be able, again, to document, to define what your source really is. Transmission of data from pro instruments. More and more over the past years, this is becoming a very important part of the conduct of clinical trials. And certainly, again, there's no paper required here, improved data quality, and of course we need to make sure we document what the source is. And lastly, the electronic health record transmission to the Ecrf. Virtually, there's no paper required here. This is a direct transmission into the Ecrf. There's technologies that exist today that will facilitate the direct transmission into the Ecrf, and I would say that within the next 5, 6 years, hopefully that's all, this will be a non-issue. There were so many issues with EDC over the years. Let's not make the capture of data from EHRs into Ecrfs an issue. One thing that we discussed internally a great deal was the concern by industry of whether EHRs need to be Part 11 compliant. And as it says here, EHRs are not regulated by FDA. They're regulated by another regulation as specified in the guidance. And so FDA does not intend to assess compliance of EHRs with 21 CFR Part 11. All right. I'm going to briefly go through data review, retention of records, and data access. Jonathan is going to discuss these three areas in a little more detail in a few minutes. Okay. Data review, investigator conducts the trial. Of course, that is true. The completed Ecrf should be reviewed and signed prior to submission to the FDA. So there was concern about that the Ecrf needed to be signed for each subject before sponsors had access for review. We have clarified that in the guidance. It's before, should be reviewed and signed prior to submission to the FDA. And certainly any modifications post sign-off need to be signed off again, and that'll be tracked in the audit trail. Retention of records. This is very important. The investigator retains control of the data. I can't say this enough, that there needs to be clear separation from sponsors and the clinical site and the source data. So the investigator retains control of the data, and the investigator provides access to source data. Paper sources transcribed into the Ecrf must be retained. And data access. So, as I just said, the sponsors, CROs, data safety monitoring boards, and other authorized personnel can view the data in the Ecrf. We feel, I mean, this has been ongoing for years for reviewing data for a number of reasons. Safety reasons, protocol violations, just in the efficiency of the conduct of the trial to make sure that perhaps one site is doesn't understand the protocol. So the review of data ongoing is very important. And of course, it's for authorized personnel only. And I believe this is the last slide. Computerized systems used in clinical investigations. This is very important. That although FDA, speaking with specifically with EHRs, does not have jurisdiction, it doesn't matter for systems in general, clinical systems in general. It's important that there will be adequate controls in place to ensure confidence in the reliability, quality, and integrity of the source data. This goes without saying. This is something that we've always attended to for many, many years. So last topic, there's a lot of discussion in the industry around various meetings about the EMA reflection paper on electronic source data versus the FDA's guidance. The EMA topics are all covered one way or another in the eSource guidance document, and I would say that some of the topics that are not covered in the eSource guidance document, they are covered in other documents. For instance, Part 11 and in the computerized systems and clinical investigations guidance. So by and large, the two documents are compatible. Okay, thank you very much. At this time, we're going to have Irfan and Jonathan come up. And first Jonathan wants to address those three topic areas, and then we're going to have them come up, and we're going to select some of your questions. There seems to be quite a bit of them, so we may not be able to get through all of them. So with that said, I'll invite Jonathan up to make a comment.
Thank you, Ron and Leonard. It's a pleasure. I just wanted to quickly go through a couple key areas, really to cover things I'd say more from an inspectional perspective. And also starting with the use of signatures, reminding folks that the use of electronic signatures still is expected to be compliant with Part 11, 21 CFR, Subpart C. And really what we're assuring in general is binding of the information in the document itself to the electronic signature to assure that that is secure, such that if that were to be broken, the electronic signature itself would also be compromised. That's just attributability towards users and the information. That's the theme. In addition, we wanted to talk just kind of a little more about what Ron was discussing regarding the audit trails and the data elements and the data element identifiers. This concept is not new. It's really the same old audit trail principle, assuring that we can preserve who entered what, when, and where, and indicating if changes were being made by whom, and of course the ability to not turn on and off the audit trail feature. This is clearly one of the most critical aspects of assurance of data integrity itself. And I would also like to mention that EDC systems pose a wonderful opportunity for direct data entry, as it can help facilitate real-time access, remote access to data. And the electronic source guidance clearly complements FDA's recently released final risk-based monitoring guidance, which discusses a move towards away from, rather, source data verification, where simply assuring the accuracy of information through audit, on-site visits, and other costly measures, but leveraging this technology to also access the data to view the clinical plausibility of data and other clinical trends of interest. So in particular, we have seen in the areas of direct data entry the use of ePro instruments effectively collecting primary safety and efficacy endpoint data. And in particular, some of the safety triggers with respect to data review, even by a clinical investigator, that we have seen being built in can include cutting across therapeutic areas, let's say from treatment of asthma, where there's repeated entries of shortness of breath, or let's say a pain study where there's repeated entries of pain, or a psychiatry study where there's repeated thoughts of suicidality, that would prompt clinical investigator intervention when necessary, when a certain threshold has been made. So you can see that the linking is both on the data quality side as well as on the patient safety side. And also wanted to talk about, as Ron referenced, a few regs, record retention regs, in particular 31262B for INDs, as well as 812.140A for IDEs for devices, for drugs and devices respectively. And that is, it's 2 years after either study completion or termination at the clinical investigator's site. They are expected to be able to preserve records and make them available for FDA. In addition, one of the real critical aspects, I would say, is chain of custody, assuring that through each stage of the process, data is created and it's managed and it's overseen and so forth, that it's attributable to authorized individuals. And also the ability to reconstruct the raw data and have faith in this information is a key aspect of our review. One also area of consideration is assuring that the sponsor doesn't have exclusive control to the data, especially, for example, when it's stored on a server or an electronic format that is owned and operated exclusively by the sponsor. In such cases, we have seen some examples where the sponsor might use trusted third parties and other types of vendors to either house or manage certain types of information, and these are unique models. And also kind of with the theme, just to get back to the chain of custody aspect, to assure that the let's say at the study completion, clinical investigators, when they retain these records, as an example, they might have originally entered data into a computer system. Let's say it was a web-based EDC, true direct data entry, and then at study completion, they might generate their own copies of records to retain because the study is over. And there's different ways of doing that. What we have seen are some cases where the clinical investigators themselves will download the information and keep it onto a CD. Other cases where the sponsor might send it to them with a procedure for verifying certain information. And there's the aspect of the certified copy being able to replace an original source record, as indicated in our final 2007 guidance on computerized systems used in clinical investigations. So these are just special considerations. And one final note, the nature of the FDA bioresearch monitoring inspection doesn't change at the site, whether it's completely automated or completely paper-based. Ultimately, we're assuring that appropriate human subject protections were in place, as well as data integrity and adherence to all applicable regulatory requirements. And some of the true value that's added is not necessarily comparing the information from the line listings, which is the data submitted to FDA, and comparing that to the information on the case report form per se at the site, but it's also looking at some of the supporting documents at the clinical investigator site, such as the case history, the patient charts, patient records, etc. And I also wanted to briefly mention that one of the during one of the original draft of this guidance, there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinterpretation around the ability for individuals while the study is active to access the data while it's live. There was a perception, or it was a misunderstanding, that the clinical investigator needed to, quote-unquote, sign off on bits and pieces of information before it was made available. We know this is not reflective of the current practice of clinical research, where there are numerous authorized individuals that might be able to access certain information and take actions, and ultimately it's recognized. Again, the key is being able to reconstruct all these activities, all this information, assuring the proper controls are in place. And a little also piece of practical advice, FDA inspectors do expect to have a list of authorized individuals at each particular site, and it might be sort of a way to verify and perhaps even challenge certain aspects of the information, that the corresponding dates between an employee's access reflect their authorization, let's say it was read-only or executable, etc. And I also wanted to mention that this guidance clearly also complements the guidance I referenced from 2007 on computerized systems used in clinical investigations, whereby it addresses and outlines some of the basic controls and expectations for these types of systems, like unique ID and encrypted password features to assure exclusive authorized access, as well as robust audit trail features and the like. And that is all of the sort of formal comments that I had prepared. It looks like we have a handful of questions on the screen, and I can start by trying to address one or two of the highlighted ones, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Irfan Khan from the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. The question: if there is no shadow case report form, what would be considered the source? That's an excellent question. So, for example, if the model is such that it's direct data entry into the system, whatever is indicated as housing that information would ultimately be considered source. So, for example, this information should be dictated or identified in the protocol, explicitly stated, ideally, if, for example, an EDC system is to be used, and it might even reference a user guide or the like, or maybe it's in the investigational plan, and that would ultimately dictate and identify who is ultimately responsible for generating and maintaining the source. So there could be another model, of course, where a copy, we have seen complex, sophisticated models where an independent copy of the clinical investigators completed and signed off case report form is available to them, and they might either store it locally on their own computer, on a hard drive, on a CD, and the like, and likewise the sponsor, another authorized party like the CRO, might retain a simultaneous copy. So the expectations are flexible in the sense that it's up to the sponsor for dictating how they expect sites to handle and use these systems and ultimately capture and retain source. And so hopefully we would be able to guide you to those SOPs and protocols and other things alike to help answer that. We have another question. Can sponsors make corrections to data in an electronic case report form? The issue that could potentially raise some concerns with respect to assurance of data integrity and preserving, again, this chain of custody of information at clinical investigator sites. So take, for example, a data clarification form, a DCF, where let's say it's flagged that certain information is incorrect and needs to be reconciled. The sponsor ultimately wouldn't directly make that change. They would, for example, in this particular case that I could imagine, the monitor, so the authorizing party would indicate to the site that there is an issue, and ultimately they would rely on the site to resolve and reconcile that issue and ultimately make the changes within the system to assure, again, that we're preserving sort of roles and responsibilities, whereas sponsors, again, need to assure that the clinical investigator sites themselves are in compliance with their respective regulatory responsibilities. I am going to share some of this opportunity with my colleague Irfan to come up and answer some questions. Okay, well, if my colleagues insist, that's fine. I can take the next one. What is the FDA's stance on scanning paper source records and converting to PDF? Would you like to, my colleague Irfan?
Thank you, Jonathan. So the question is, what is the FDA stance on scanning paper source and converting to PDF? So when you're converting a document to PDF, that could be considered basically a paper document. It's not really an electronic case report form. So when you do that, you would still have to keep the paper source available for FDA to review, unless you decide to make that PDF certified. Then it could be possible where you don't need to have the paper documents anymore. But one thing I want to make clear is that converting something to PDF, it does not make it an electronic case report. It's not something you're entering into the system. It's just something you're converting it to PDF. So we would want to see the paper document available for FDA inspection. I think Jonathan would like to add a few words to that as well.
Yes, I'd like to briefly add that once a paper document is converted to PDF, it could be considered within an electronic format. And therefore, let's say, assuring that where it resides and the controls that are in place to assure only authorized individuals have access to it, those kinds of questions could then arise. But ultimately, FDA doesn't have any formal stance or policy on the specific issue of scanning paper source and converting to PDFs. It's up to the sponsor to demonstrate compliance with applicable regs.
Everyone, please stay on the line. We're having an issue with our computer. We have to restart it, and we will continue to answer questions. Please give us 2 to 3 minutes while we restart the computer. Thank you.
Form, what would be considered the source? It would be whatever the protocol or the investigational plan would dictate it to be as such. And to make sure it's consistent, you're consistently following it. What is source? Is there a certified copy? You know, think about things how they were in the paper world. There was the white paper, the yellow copy, and the pink paper. And how did that work? And in the electronic world, it kind of really doesn't function any differently, except you're using a system, you're tapping it into a computer, a computer now, and you're just breaking up the form electronically. Who owns it? Where does that go? How's it being kept? Those are the kind of questions. I'm assuming, here, Irfan's next.
So the next question we have here is what regulation covers EHRs? And that's actually mentioned in the guidance, and it's 45 CFR Part 170. So you can look it up in the guidance, and it's mentioned there.
What is electronic case report forms are usually provided to clinical investigators on a disk. Will FDA be able to read this at a site inspection? Presumably, as I indicated before, the element of the chain of custody arises. Where was this information generated from? As investigators, they will often challenge. It's a little bit of a shortcut, if you will, to just accept information on a disk when at a site. What is the source of this? Is there a database? What are the controls and procedures that dictated how this got here? Did it come via FedEx? Did the sponsor generate it and send it? These kinds of things are important, but ultimately, I think the ability to provide FDA with all necessary documents and information relevant to demonstrate compliance is what's most critical. And so don't be surprised again if an investigator challenges, even, for example, I've seen cases where I show up for a site inspection and they sign on with a FDA inspector logon. Well, that's not acceptable because ideally I would like to access the same information that everyone else is and not be restricted or filtered to what information might be ideal for the investigator to look at. So it's this aspect of complete access to systems that's important as well. I'm going to keep going here. Again, thank you for staying with us through the technical difficulties. What are your feelings on using paper as a backup to electronic source data from a malfunctioning electronic patient-reported outcome device? Do you encourage that? Well, let's be honest, things happen. There are cases where you forget to bring your charger, or in certain cases, instead of customized instruments, where even the bring your own devices, my own iPhone really doesn't have more of a battery life than 2.5 hours for some reason. So ultimately, if I went on a vacation for a week or so and forgot to bring the charger, I would like to still, and I was enrolled in a trial, you don't want to lose that opportunity. And obviously, we have seen cases where SOPs will specifically dictate these kinds of examples where in the event the instrument's malfunctioning or not working or you're unable to access it, that they provide a backup paper source. And it could be acceptable, provided they were authorized to do so and followed all the instructions accordingly. Okay, let's see. If we do a direct data entry, how can it be verified? So I assume a sponsor or a clinical investigator. How can it be verified if a clinical investigator were to directly enter data into a computer system? Well, it would be verified by the protocol itself that would dictate, or the user guide that would tell the individuals at the sites to log on and either enter information into a website or to fill out a specific designated form. So let's say in the case of direct data entry that there would be certain access controls associated with the website and service that was provided that could be demonstrated, were consistently followed, etc. So again, there's multiple ways that a sponsor or a site could demonstrate that suitable direct data entry was completed, and that's also an aspect I wanted to discuss. That even the essence of validation itself, validating for its intended use. We're really talking about fit for purpose. In this case, is the system able to complement the needs of the protocol, collect the specific kind of data that you need, and that the design is reflected of those user needs. Ultimately, there is a trend towards, as Ron and Leonard mentioned, a move away from paper-based documentation and being able to adopt these automated technologies. And we at FDA would really like to see them reach the full opportunities, reach the full potential that they present. And there's really no bounds. It's really limitless. I think, the whole model of conducting research is moving beyond just brick and mortar sites. We're now seeing virtual trial models where source data is going to be extremely important, and the controls and the monitoring, and the same traditional questions exist. We're really just talking about a different environment. And so as the regulations in many ways try to catch up with some of these technologies, it's really an exciting time for the entire biotech pharmaceutical industry as we grow, and hopefully we're able to address some of these compliance issues and potential misperceptions. I think we're back up and running now, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm going to take a shot at another question, and then Irfan's going to come up. When you audit a site, do you expect to access the system itself? Or is the output casebooks, for example, sufficient? That's a good question. Certainly, as usual, there's a lot of discretion for the FDA investigator. So there's a section on in the CPGM on the Bioresearch Monitoring Compliance Guide that identifies the kinds of questions that are going to be asked if a site is using computer systems or electronic records or electronic signatures. So I would also direct you to that as a valuable resource. And in general, the expectation is that you're going to have access to the source information as best as possible. In cases where it is outsourced, for example, the buzzword, the cloud, which is nothing more than outsourcing IT capabilities and technology, is that all relevant information and control system controls, whether it's on a server remotely or how that was configured and all, those kinds of issues. It just needs to be transparent. And if the need should arise for FDA to also, let's say, it has happened where we're at one site and realize a lot of the data, the true electronic source data, is physically located somewhere else, they might either remotely access some of the information in certain cases or might opt to issue potentially another inspection to access that information. At this time, I will call upon my colleague Irfan to come up and also share in addressing some of the questions as well. Thank you.
So the next question we have, you referred to a list of authorized persons who have access to the data. If the computerized system does not produce such a list automatically, are manual processes or other computerized system acceptable to produce such a list? Yes, it is acceptable as long as there is a list available for the investigator to know the personnel that have access to the system. We can use that, and it is acceptable. Jonathan will take the next question.
Sure. If FDA does not plan on assessing an investigator's EHR for Part 11 compliance, does FDA have a preference for CRAs to monitor from EHR or monitor from a printed certified copy? That's an excellent question. FDA doesn't have any formal policy on the area. And this is actually strikes a important chord, especially as we move towards risk-based monitoring, because ultimately this is one of the challenges that monitors are faced with. When they go to sites and either due to HIPAA compliance and other restraints, institutional policies might not necessarily be authorized to access some of this information. So they might rely upon, as mentioned, printed copies to monitor the information. And ultimately, they have to rely that this printed copy is an accurate and complete representation of everything in the record. There's obviously challenges with respect to maybe they missed a page, or the issue of the floating piece of free text, which is a huge concern. Potentially, let's say, an added ConMed, or let's say an emergency room visit, which either could be indicative of an adverse event that might not have been reported. And so obviously these are some nightmares, but I think there is now a move. Certain EHR vendors, for example, offer the ability to remotely access in read-only capabilities, authorize individuals, enrolled subjects, electronic health records, and the issue really even gets more complicated when thinking about things on an international and global scale, specifically because 70% of all data submitted to the Center for Drugs included data from outside the United States. And so recognizing that not just domestic use, but international use, sponsors just have to take into consideration variable use of EHR systems globally, and through hopefully designing and writing a very high-quality protocol and a case report form that collects relevant, necessary, and critical information, while understanding that they might also have certain needs from a IT capability, site qualification perspective, and it's up to the sponsor. FDA doesn't have any preference or formal policy on those expectations. It's up to the sponsor to establish their own level of comfort, so to speak, that they can assure that all applicable regulatory requirements can be filled. And I have one last one. And what about issues with obtaining medical records and CIs taking verbals and directly entering it into the electronic case report form? How can this information ever be verified to ensure subjects meet inclusion-exclusion criteria? So
Thank you, Jonathan. So this is a very good question. So one thing we want to clarify is that when a CI or principal investigator is entering into the electronic case report form, he is the originator, and there isn't necessarily any need for additional verification. At a clinical site, it always should be the investigator who is not always, but one of the main originator of entering data into the electronic case report form. So we would say there wouldn't need any additional verification to confirm whatever data is entered by the clinical investigator. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to my colleagues. I guess we've come to the end of our time. I wanted to thank you all in the audience for your patience. We apologize for the interruption due to the computer shutdown, but we hope that we've been able to get to most of your questions. And these slides and the recording will be posted on fda.gov. So thanks again, and we'll sign off here.